Story number 1.
When Sarah and Mark moved into their quiet suburban neighborhood, they were excited for a fresh start. The house was perfect, spacious, well-lit, and nestled between two other homes, each with a neatly kept lawn. Everything about the neighborhood seemed peaceful, except for the house next door. It was a tall, narrow home with an overgrown yard and dark curtains covering every window. The shutters were cracked, the paint was peeling, and the place gave off a cold, unsettling feeling. Their other neighbors had come by to introduce themselves, but no one mentioned the house next door. It was as if it didn't exist. Mark, always the skeptic, shrugged it off. Probably just some old shut-in. Nothing weird about it, he said. Sarah wasn't so sure. There was something off about it. That first night, as Sarah was brushing her teeth, she glanced out the bathroom window, which faced the house next door. A shadow moved behind the curtains, a person, tall and thin, just standing there. Her breath hitched. "Mark," she whispered, calling him into the bathroom. By the time he arrived, the figure was gone. "It's just your imagination," Mark said, but Sarah wasn't convinced. The next day, she decided to ask around. At the grocery store, she struck up a conversation with the cashier, a woman in her 50s who had lived in the neighborhood for years. "That house next door," Sarah said. "Do you know who lives there?" The woman's face paled. "No one," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah frowned. "No one? But I saw..." The cashier cut her off. "No one alive has lived in that house for years." Sarah's stomach dropped. The woman hesitated before continuing. "There was a family, the Grays. Husband, wife, 2 kids. One night, something terrible happened. The husband snapped, or at least that's what people think. He killed them, and then himself. The house has been empty ever since. No one stays there. Strange things happen." Sarah felt her skin crawl. That night, she kept the curtains drawn tight, but sleep didn't come easily. Around 2 a.m., a sound woke her up. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, almost gentle, but it was coming from the window. Mark was snoring beside her. Heart pounding, Sarah turned her head slowly toward the window. The curtains were closed, but she could see the faint outline of something on the other side. A shape, and then tap, 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 3 soft knocks. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the blanket over her head. She stayed that way until dawn. By morning, she convinced herself it had been a tree branch or an animal, but when she stepped outside, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There were no trees near the window, and in the dirt below, there were footprints. Small ones like those of a child. That night, Sarah refused to sleep in their bedroom. They moved to the living room where she felt safer, wrapped in the glow of the television. But as the night deepened, something made her glance toward the front window. A figure stood on the sidewalk. It was a child, a little boy in old-fashioned pajamas, staring up at their house. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Mark," she whispered, shaking him awake. By the time he opened his eyes, the child was gone. Mark, still groggy, mumbled, "You're letting that story get to you." But Sarah knew what she had seen. The next morning, she went back to the grocery store and found the cashier again. "The Grays had children," Sarah said. "A little boy?" The woman nodded, her face somber. "Yes, Thomas. He was 6. Sarah felt sick. That evening, as they sat in the living room, Mark finally admitted something. "I've been hearing things too," he said. "Whispers from the walls." Sarah swallowed hard. "We need to leave." Mark nodded. "Tomorrow." That night was the worst of all. At exactly 2 a.m., the knocking started again. Not at the window this time, at the front door. Knock, knock, knock. Mark sat up, his face pale. Sarah clutched his arm. Then from the hallway, a soft voice. "Let me in." It was a child's voice. Sarah's stomach twisted. The doorknob rattled. Then the voice came again. This time, closer. "Please, let me in." Mark leapt up and grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the couch. He yanked open the front door. Nothing. Only the empty street. But on the porch, in the dim glow of the street lamp, were tiny wet footprints, and written on the glass of the front window, as if traced by a small damp hand, were the words, "Don't leave me." The next morning, they packed their things and left. They never looked back. A month later, Sarah got curious and checked the house online. It was listed for sale again, just like it had been before they moved in. No one ever stayed. Story the end.
Story number 2.
When Ethan and Rachel moved into their new home, they were eager for a fresh start. The house was a modest 2-story in a quiet neighborhood, just the kind of place they had been looking for. The neighbors seemed friendly, except for the house directly next to theirs. It was different. Unlike the other well-maintained homes on the block, this one was in disrepair. The paint was peeling, the lawn was overgrown, and the windows were covered with thick, dark curtains. The only sign of life was the dim glow of a single light in the upstairs window at night. Ethan noticed it first. "The house next door, do you ever see anyone come or go?" he asked Rachel one evening as they ate dinner. She shook her head. "No. I figured someone elderly lives there. Maybe a shut-in." Ethan wasn't so sure. That night, he was taking the trash out when he felt eyes on him. He turned and looked up at the house. The upstairs window was slightly open, and behind the curtain, he could see a shadowy figure watching him. When he blinked, the figure was gone. The next morning, Ethan decided to introduce himself. He walked over and knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, louder. After a long silence, the door creaked open an inch. A voice, hoarse and whispery, drifted through the gap. "You shouldn't have come." Ethan stepped back. I just wanted to say hello. We just moved in next door." The door shut with a soft but deliberate click. That night, Rachel woke up suddenly. A faint sound drifted through the walls, a rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming against wood. Ethan groaned. "What is that?" Rachel sat up. The sound was coming from the direction of the neighbor's house. "Maybe it's just pipes or something?" Ethan mumbled. But Rachel wasn't convinced. It continued for hours. Just when she thought it had stopped, it would start again, always the same pattern. The next day, she spoke to Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived across the street. "The house next door, who lives there?" Rachel asked. Mrs. Henderson's expression darkened. "You don't know?" Rachel shook her head. "The Garrett family used to live there," Mrs. Henderson said. "The father, James Garrett, was not right in the head, very controlling. People say he kept his daughter locked away in that house for years." Rachel's stomach tightened. "What happened to them?" "The mother died. Then, one night, James just disappeared. The daughter, too. No one ever saw them again." Rachel shivered. "And the house? Who owns it now?" "No one," Mrs. Henderson said. "It's been empty for nearly 20 years. Rachel's blood ran cold. That night, she and Ethan lay in bed, unable to sleep. At exactly 3 a.m., the tapping started again. But this time, it was closer. Rachel gripped Ethan's arm. "That's not coming from their house." Ethan sat up, his face pale, Schreider's. The sound was coming from their bedroom wall. Tap, tap, tap. Rachel couldn't breathe. Slowly, Ethan reached out and knocked back. The tapping stopped. Then, one single knock from the other side of the wall. The next morning, Ethan had had enough. He grabbed a flashlight and went outside, determined to check out the house once and for all. The back door was unlocked. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The furniture was covered in white sheets, untouched for years. The living room was still, the silence heavy. Then, upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Ethan's pulse quickened. He followed the sound, his footsteps careful. The dim light from his flashlight cast eerie shadows on the walls. At the end of the hallway, he saw a door slightly ajar. He pushed it open. Inside was a small bedroom. The bed was unmade, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper, and in the corner, next to a broken dresser, was a tiny wooden chair. Ethan stepped closer, and his breath caught in his throat. Scratched into the wood of the chair were words, over and over again. Let me out, let me out, let me out." Ethan turned and ran. That night, neither he nor Rachel could sleep. At 3 a.m., the tapping started again. But now, it was coming from inside their closet. Ethan grabbed a bat and yanked the closet door open. There was nothing there, just an empty space. Then Rachel screamed. She was pointing at the wall behind the clothes. Faint, but unmistakable, words had been scratched into the wood. "Let me in." Story the end.
Story number 3.
When Tom and Lisa moved into their new suburban home, they were eager for a quiet life. The neighborhood was peaceful, the houses well kept, and everything seemed perfect, except for the house next door. It was old, unkempt, with peeling paint and an overgrown lawn. The blinds were always drawn, and despite living there for weeks, they had never seen anyone come or go. One evening, as Lisa was watering the front yard, she noticed an elderly woman peeking through the blinds of the house next door. The woman's eyes were dark, sunken, and locked onto Lisa. But the moment Lisa made eye contact, the blinds snapped shut. Later that night, Lisa told Tom about the woman. "I swear she was just staring at me. It was unsettling." Maybe she's just a nosy old lady, Tom shrugged. Some people are like that. But Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few days, she started noticing strange things. At night, she would hear faint knocking sounds coming from the shared wall of their bedroom, as if someone were tapping from the other side. The sound was rhythmic, 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, Lisa knocked back. Silence. Then a single knock responded. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Tom, half asleep, dismissed it. "Old houses make noises, babe. Don't stress." But Lisa felt something was wrong. The next afternoon, she decided to introduce herself. She knocked on the neighbor's door, expecting to finally meet the woman properly. No answer. She knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Just as she turned to leave, the door creaked open. A frail woman stood in the doorway. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her hollow eyes bore into Lisa's. The air around her smelled of mildew and something else. Something rotting. "Hello," Lisa managed. "I'm Lisa. My husband and I live next door. I just wanted to say hi." The woman didn't speak. She simply stared, her lips barely parted, her breathing shallow. Lisa forced a nervous smile. "Well, if you ever need anything, we're right next door." The woman's lips trembled as if she wanted to say something, but instead, she slowly closed the door. That night, the knocking started again. 3 slow knocks, a pause, 3 more. Lisa grabbed Tom's arm. "It's happening again," Tom groaned, rubbing his face. "Fine, I'll check it out." He got up and walked next door, knocking firmly. No response. After a moment, he twisted the doorknob. To his surprise, it opened. "Hello?" he called. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Silence. The air inside was thick, damp, suffocating. The house smelled of dust and decay. Tom stepped inside cautiously, his shoes creaking against the warped wooden floor. Then he saw it. A figure was sitting in a chair in the living room, facing away. "Ma'am?" He took a step closer, and the chair turned slightly, revealing the old woman slumped lifelessly. Her mouth was open, her skin sagging and gray. Tom stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat. The woman was dead. For how long, he wasn't sure. But judging by the state of her body, at least a week. His mind raced. No, this wasn't possible. Lisa had just spoken to her earlier that day. He turned and bolted out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Lisa saw his pale face and knew something was wrong. "Call the police," he gasped. When the authorities arrived, they confirmed it. The woman had been dead for at least 10 days. There was no way she had answered the door, no way she had been watching Lisa from the window. As the coroner wheeled the body out, a police officer approached them. "Strange thing," he said. "We found something written on the inside of her bedroom door, like she was scratching at it from the inside." Lisa's stomach turned. "What did it say?" The officer hesitated. Then he spoke. "They won't let me leave." That night, Lisa and Tom barely slept. Every creak in the house made them jump. Every shadow in the corner of their vision felt like someone watching. At exactly 3 a.m., a sound shattered the silence. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 3 more. This time, it wasn't coming from the shared wall. It was coming from inside their closet. Story the end.
Story number 4.
When David and Emily moved into their new rental home, they were eager for a fresh start. It was a quiet cul-de-sac, lined with nearly identical houses except for the one next door. It was old, weathered, and had a yard overtaken by weeds. The curtains were always drawn, and they never saw anyone coming or going. The landlord mentioned that the house had been vacant for years, but on their first night, as Emily unpacked in the kitchen, she caught movement from the corner of her eye. A figure stood in the darkened window of the neighboring house, watching. "David," she whispered, "I think someone's next door." David joined her at the window, but the figure was gone. "Probably a trick of the light," he said. That night, Emily woke up gasping. A scratching sound came from the bedroom window, slow and deliberate, like fingernails against glass. She nudged David awake, and they both listened in silence. The scratching stopped. The next morning, she met Mrs. Caldwell, an elderly neighbor from across the street. "Oh dear," the old woman said when Emily mentioned the house. "You didn't know?" "Know what?" "That house? There was a family there, years ago. They were strange. The father was controlling, paranoid. The daughter, well, she was never seen outside. Then one day, the whole family just disappeared." Emily's stomach churned. That night, she woke again to the sound of scratching. But this time, there was something else. a whispering voice, faint and broken. "Help. Please." David ran to the window, yanked the curtains open, but there was nothing there. The next day, they called the landlord again, asking about the house next door. "It's been empty for decades," he said. "No one's rented it since the girl went missing." Emily felt sick. "What girl?" The landlord hesitated. "They never found her body, but the father swore she was still in the house." That night, the whispering grew louder, desperate. Then came the knocking, slow, insistent, coming from their bedroom closet. David grabbed a bat and yanked the door open. Inside, there was no one, just a bare, empty closet. But there, scratched into the wood, were words. "I'm still here." They left the house the next morning, never returned. A year later, Emily searched for news articles about the missing girl. She found an old photo, and there, staring back at her, was the same pale face she had seen in the window that first night. Story the end.
Story number 5.
When Sarah and her husband, Mark, moved into their new home, they were thrilled. It was an old Victorian house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place they had always dreamed of. The only downside was the house next door, a crumbling, neglected structure with boarded-up windows and an overgrown yard. On their first night, while unpacking, Sarah noticed a flicker of movement from the house next door. She peered out the window and saw a pale face staring at her from between the wooden slats covering the upstairs window. It vanished the moment she made eye contact. "Mark," she said, nudging him, "I think someone's watching us from that house." He glanced up briefly and shrugged. "Probably just your imagination. That place looks abandoned." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The next morning, an old man appeared in their driveway. He was gaunt, with sunken eyes and a stiff gait. He introduced himself as Mr. Doyle, the supposed owner of the house next door. "I saw you moving in," he said in a raspy voice. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Something about him unsettled Sarah. His stare lingered too long, his smile too forced. "Do you live there alone?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "No, not exactly." That night, Sarah woke to a soft tapping sound. It was coming from the window. Her stomach knotted as she turned her head. Through the darkness, she saw a shadowy figure standing outside. She gasped and grabbed Mark, who jumped out of bed. When he looked, the figure was gone. The next day, Sarah knocked on Mr. Doyle's door. It creaked open, revealing a dim interior with dust-covered furniture. The smell of mildew hung in the air. "Mr. Doyle?" she called. No response. She was about to leave when she heard something upstairs, a faint shuffling noise, followed by a whisper. She bolted back to her house. That evening, they decided to call the police. An officer arrived, but after a brief search, he found no signs of forced entry. Mr. Doyle insisted he lived alone. Days passed. The noises continued. Footsteps at odd hours, whispers in the night. One evening, Sarah glanced out her window and saw Mr. Doyle standing in his yard. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes staring at her window. That night, Mark woke up to Sarah's screams. She was sitting up in bed, shaking. "I saw them," she whispered. There were people in the room. Mark searched the house but found nothing. The final straw came when they heard the voice on their baby monitor. It was distorted and breathy. "Not safe. Get out." Mark and Sarah fled to a hotel that night. The next morning, they returned with a real estate agent determined to sell the house. But when they arrived, something was different. The house next door was gone. Not abandoned, not burned down, just gone. The lot was empty, as if no house had ever stood there. Mark asked the neighbors, but none of them remembered a house ever being there. No one had ever heard of Mr. Doyle. Sarah and Mark moved far away, but the experience haunted them forever, because sometimes, in the middle of the night, Sarah still hears the whispers.
Story number 6.
When Daniel and Megan moved into their new house, they were excited to finally settle down. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where people smiled and waved but didn't pry too much. Everything was perfect, except for the neighbors next door. The house beside them was different. The paint was chipped, the windows covered with heavy curtains, and the lawn was overgrown. But what unsettled Daniel the most was the family living inside. He saw them on the first night while taking out the trash. A man and woman stood on their front porch, perfectly still, staring at him, not waving, not smiling, just staring. Daniel hesitated, then gave them a small nod. The woman's mouth twitched like she was about to say something, but instead, She turned abruptly and went inside. The man followed without a word. When Daniel told Megan, she shrugged. Maybe they're just awkward. But it didn't feel like that. Over the next few weeks, the strange behavior continued. The couple rarely left their house, and when they did, they walked stiffly, heads down, never making eye contact. Sometimes at night, Daniel would glance out the window and see them standing in their yard, looking toward his house. One night, Megan woke up shaking. "I heard something," she whispered. Daniel listened. At first, silence. Then, a faint sound like fingernails scratching against their bedroom wall. "It's just the pipes," Daniel muttered, but deep down he wasn't so sure. The next morning, Megan had a bad feeling. "I'm going over there," she said. Daniel grabbed her arm. "Megan, don't." But she was already out the door. She knocked, no answer. She knocked again, louder. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was thick, stale, like the house had been abandoned for years. The furniture was old, covered in dust. A single chair sat in the middle of the living room, facing the wall. Megan's heart pounded. "Hello?" A voice, barely a whisper, answered. "You shouldn't have come." Megan turned and ran. That night at exactly 3 a.m., they woke to a sound outside. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling their house. Daniel grabbed a bat and peeked through the blinds. The neighbors were standing on their lawn, their faces pale, eyes hollow, staring directly at the house. Then, without moving their lips, both of them whispered in unison, "Let us in." Daniel slammed the blinds shut. The next morning, he went to the police. An officer listened quietly, then frowned. "That house has been empty for years," he said. Daniel felt a chill creep down his spine. "No," he insisted. "We've seen them. They live right next door." The officer sighed. "The last owners, a couple, disappeared 10 years ago. No one ever found them." Daniel and Megan left that night, refusing to spend another second in that house. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, Daniel still hears them, scratching at the walls, whispering through the vents, begging to be let in.